Backyard Farmer Presents Lifestyle Gardening is a production of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension.
Good morning and welcome to Lifestyle Gardening. I'm Kim Todd and we have another wonderful program for you today. Earlier in the season we showed you some good choices for bulbs and we also demonstrated how to plant them. We'll be taking a look at some bulbs in full bloom later on in the show, and we'll also be checking out some interesting coleus combinations. We'd like to start this morning by helping you with some solutions to a common problem in tomato plants, which is blossom end rot. Here to help us is Extension Educator Amy Timmerman.
Blossom end rot is one of those problems about every gardener has run across into their garden. Blossom end rot can actually affect several different types of plants. We'll see it on watermelons, but probably the primary source that we see it is on those pesky tomato plants. And when we see blossom end rot, typically what we see on the outside is at the very butt end of the tomato, we'll start seeing a brown sunken in area, and that will continue to grow, but about the same size as the diameter of the tomato. Over time, it will start looking fuzzy, and that's because it allows other secondary pathogens to move in there, and they start to eat at the decaying tissue at that point in time. Besides that version, we also have a second version of blossom end rot that we see in tomatoes, and it's an internal blossom end rot. And with internal blossom end rot, the tomato fruit actually looks perfectly normal on the outside. You're not seeing a bump or a black spot at the butt end of that tomato fruit. So when you cut it open and toward that bottom end of that tomato, you'll see this dark brown lesion on the inside. It can be anything from about a dime in diameter up to a quarter in diameter. Now the big question that we have, okay, we have tomatoes with blossom end rot, whether it's the external version that we typically see or we have the internal blossom end rot. What can we do with the tomatoes? And the nice thing to know is the tomatoes are still edible to you. All you need to do is cut out that black area, black to brown area, and you can continue to eat your tomatoes. It doesn't affect the flavor, it doesn't affect canning ability of those tomatoes or anything at that point in time. So they're completely usable. Now the next question is, what can we do to control it or prevent it from occurring? There's a lot of different theories around blossom end rot, what's actually causing it. There's evidence to say that it's a calcium deficiencies, there's evidence that maybe it's a watering issue, but whatever it really is, it's more of an environmental issue. And there isn't a lot that we can do for it. We know that we have some tomato varieties that are a lot more susceptible to it. So typically what we recommend is, if you have a problem this year with that tomato variety, just don't select it. Next year, try a different variety. That may get you away from the problem. Can we add calcium to the soil to help with that possible calcium deficiency? And the answer is no. Typically, we have enough calcium present in the soil. The plants just aren't uptaking them up as much as we actually need available for the plant. So adding more calcium isn't going to help you. The other big key with it is just make sure you do constant maintained watering throughout the growing season. Everything is showing that if you do a constant watering schedule, even with a more susceptible variety to blossom end rot, typically you're not seeing as much. So you want to make sure you're watering it consistently through the summer, especially when we get into those drier days, or turning off that hose when we get that nice summer rain in July and August. But the other advantage is by having a good watering schedule is you're also going to prevent your possibility of cracking of your tomatoes. And that's where you're going to get those lesions on the top, on the caxil, on the top part of that tomato fruit. So that's your best thing. If you do watering, proper variety selection, typically you should be able to deter any blossom end rot. If you run into it, just cut it out and continue eating those tomatoes from your garden.
Although there isn't an actual cure for blossom end rot, selecting resistant varieties and a consistent watering schedule are really the best ways to avoid the problem. Later on in our program, Amy will return to talk about some other common disease issues with tomatoes, and she'll detail some tips to keep them under control. If you're looking for some unique color options for your ornamental beds and containers, there are plenty of great selections of coleus available. Many come in vibrant shades of chartreuse and others have multiple colors and variations. Combining these colors with other similar ornamentals in a container can make the perfect accent for your home. Here to show us a few of these combinations is Luann Finke.
Coleus is always a real favorite of gardeners, and this year we have many new options to provide. So look for those as you're trying to plan your combinations. Our season starts in January by bringing in unrooted cuttings from Costa Rica and Israel, and we put roots on those plants. They go into a very humid, well-heated bottom heat environment, so it's absolutely ideal to grow roots. And really, that's the secret to success. A plant with great roots is going to perform the very best for you in your garden, and ultimately, that's what really counts. This season offers lots of great new options for coleus. We know them to be big, beefy plants that will grow in just about any environment. Full sun, part shade, and many of them for very shady environments. And the same hold true for many of our new introductions. However, what I would find to be a great improvement is we're being able to offer more that have more of a smaller texture. If a criticism of coleus would be they get too big and they overpower our combinations. So let's use this opportunity to have some smaller things to know that they're going to combine well with other flowering plants to create those mixed combinations. The other idea I would suggest is maybe this is the year to keep it as simple as possible. Maybe you do planters of just coleus, and here gives you an idea of the variety that you can be using with your coleus so that perhaps they would look good alone or in combinations of as you have classically done. A series of plants that we found last summer was called the Marquise series, and who wouldn't love Blonde Bombshell? It's a nice bright color that has more of a blonde tone to it, and we find that it's more of a mounding growth plant. We actually grew some of these plants as samples last year and they performed very well, but it's a color palette that you can see here I find very attractive. So this would be a good combiner. In that series, there's also a red carpet, so you have some red tone to it, again more of a mounding form. And finally the bronze, which looks so good by itself or combined with other things as well. There's also a series called the Hottie series. So we have a spicy one and a hottie one. And those look very similar right now in the greenhouse, but we're going to watch them over the season of production, and you will see how they change. As you look closer at this plant, you can see within this production flat the variety that you can get just based on temperatures and light exposure. So who knows what the season promises ahead for that. And whether you decide to use the coleus by themselves or to combine with other plants, I think you'll find it's a group of plants that are very promising for beautiful results in your containers and landscape beds.
The addition of any of these varieties of coleus to your landscape beds or containers will certainly be a great touch. Once again, the concepts of color and color combinations as well as texture are things to keep in mind when making your selections for the upcoming season. And as we've just seen, there are plenty of great options for you. Last time we were with you, we talked about how to make your own compost and incorporate it into your garden soil. For this week's landscape lesson, we're going to show you a couple of products for the kitchen to help you collect those everyday scraps for the compost pile. A lot of people who compost their garden waste also want to be able to compost those kitchen scraps during the winter months in particular, and don't necessarily want to take a trip out to that compost pile in the dark, in the snow, in the cold. One of the things that has become very popular is kitchen composters, and there are a couple of them here to look at, very different in terms of the character of the little composters, but absolutely the same in terms of function. What you're looking for is a compost element, a composter that will have the capability of filtering out odors, and that is typically holes in the lid with a charcoal filter. You want to be able to easily transport the composter so that when it is filled with great compost, you can dump that on the garden. You want to also be able to limit the quantity of scraps you put in it at one given time. So these are about a gallon or a little bit larger than that. They have holes in the lid. One is a heavy ceramic, so it's very substantial, looks a little bit like a hydrant, comes in different colors. The other is a recycled plastic. You also oftentimes with a kitchen composter want to use a bag within it, which helps with the cleanliness. And if you're really interested in recycling, look for a recyclable bag. So you have the capability again of using that in the compost pile as well. We put kitchen scraps, not meats, not dairy products into these. You want to make sure you change the filter frequently enough so that it does capture the odors. And if you want to speed the process along, you go to the bait shop and you buy red wigglers, which are bitty little worms that absolutely love to eat the compost. They will really speed up the operation. Sounds a little creepy to some people to have worms in the kitchen on the counter. Keep in mind that they are trapped within the composter. They are not going to be able to crawl up and go out the holes in the lid. Let them do their job. You may have seen earthworm castings as really a highly prized compost material for the garden. That is what those worms do as they eat through all of those banana peels and apples and tops of carrots and eggshells that you have put into the composter. So unlike keeping a big old plastic bag in the sink that begins to get all gooey and smelly, the kitchen composters allow you to do something that is very good for the garden, very good for the environment, pretty good for the kitchen without having all the mess and fuss. Your own homemade compost is one of the best amendments you can put into your soil. Of course, you can collect your kitchen vegetable scraps any way you want, but these products offer the added bonus of a charcoal filter to help keep those nasty odors to a minimum. And it's really a fantastic way to recycle things that would normally go into the garbage disposal. We featured bulb selection and planting in some earlier shows this season, and it's only right that you get a glimpse of what pops out of the ground after your bulbs have survived the cold winter. Right now, we'd like to feature some interesting and colorful selections from the ordinary tulip to something a little more exotic. Let's take a look at bulbs in bloom. Many gardeners really look forward to the beauty of bulbs in their spring landscape. You have to plan in advance, however, for that to happen because most bulbs need to be purchased in the summer or the fall, planted in the fall, marked so you don't dig into them when you're doing your other garden chores, and then that excitement or that surprise of those bulbs coming up in the spring gives you all of that wonderful enjoyment. We're going to focus a little bit on choosing 5 or 6 of the bulbs that you can use in the landscape and how they should be designed properly, and then we'll talk about management in another segment. Let's start with hyacinths. These tend to be the soldiers of the bulb world. They're stiff, they're short, they come in a wide array of colors, they're incredibly fragrant. You'll often see these in containers in the grocery stores or in the nurseries because they're very easy to force. You can also put hyacinths in the landscape after you have forced them, and they really will reliably come back year after year. They're used improperly oftentimes by planting them in little lines exactly the same distance apart, which actually makes them look even more rigid and less natural in the landscape. So you're better off to mix colors, or if you're going to use a single color, at least plant them in drifts so that the spacing is not exactly even. A second bulb that is beloved by many is daffodils or jonquils. These are oftentimes very reliably perennial in our climate, and they can be naturalized as well in big drifts and masses. They come in an array of colors that includes whites, salmons, some pinks, and of course the yellows and golds. Some are fragrant, some are not. They're great for cutting, but again, they're best used in big drifts and masses as opposed to in little tiny clumps that look a little unusual or unnatural in the landscape. A true favorite is the minor bulbs, and we use that word because they're so tiny and small. Oftentimes they're blue. Scylla is one of them, Glory of the Snow is another. Even the snowdrops, which are the very earliest of the flowering bulbs, is considered a minor bulb. And the great thing about these is you can plant them by the hundreds, and should plant them in very large quantities. You can actually naturalize them in a mulch bed under shrubs. You can do the same thing actually in the high shade of kind of a thin turf, where maybe it is difficult for the turf to get a hold, but the bulbs themselves will actually shine blue as though you have a blue lawn for just that very short period of time in the spring. Oftentimes these will naturalize all by themselves by setting seed, so that becomes a really good way to use those minor bulbs. Tulips are not reliably perennially hardy here, but that color range is fabulous. Treat them like an annual, again, big drifts and masses or clumps at kind of that perfect focal point. And then finally, one of the ones that is really unusual and interesting is the checkered lily, or guinea head lily, or snake's head lily. Arching stem, and every single one of the segments on those little flowers looks like a checkerboard. So that becomes a perfect example of a surprise bulb in the landscape, and they really do work well in clumps. Spring isn't spring without these wonderful bulbs poking out of the soil and eventually exploding with color. It's a sign that spring has truly arrived. Like we've said in earlier segments, bulbs do take a bit of planning and patience, but once they're established, they will give you years of beauty and satisfaction. Let's take a few minutes now to answer our viewer emails. We'd love to hear from you, and perhaps you can share a picture or two with us. Just send us an email to byf@unl.edu. Our first question today comes from a viewer in Kearney. They have some new trees, and they were planted last fall, and they were not wrapped with any sort of tree wrap. Then they see around town trees that either have the craft paper or the stuff that actually looks like paper with tape at the top. They see a handful that have a black tube, looks like corrugated drainage pipe around them. And then they see some of them that are white, sort of a spirally looking thing with holes in it. They're wondering why we wrap trees and which one of those is the best idea. What we typically recommend is if you have a new tree that has a really thin bark, maples come to mind, some of our smaller ornamental trees that have a very thin bark, you may want to go ahead and wrap that the first year. And what you're attempting to do is protect that from sun scald and frost crack as much as anything. That helps shade and protect that trunk from those changes in temperature that can really occur in the winter months and cause that trunk to heat up. We don't recommend using black because that actually will cause that environment to be even darker and hotter. We also never recommend leaving the wrap on beyond a single season. What can happen then is critters get up underneath there. It's a great, wonderful, moist environment in which they can multiply and cause actually more damage than would happen if the tree is not wrapped. The spiral is really a great choice. It expands with the tree. It also has holes for breathing and allowing air to get in. We have a viewer who is up in the Coleridge area who has a honey locust, and unfortunately it sounds like this is one that is producing a lot of those pods, long curly pods, falling all over the landscape and the lawn in the fall of the year, being carried away by squirrels because they love those seeds inside. And his question is there a way to keep a honey locust from producing the pods? Unfortunately, the answer is no. What you need to do if you're starting from scratch is choose one that has been selected for its thornlets. Let's start with thornless because that's way more important than the pods, but also one that is male that is not going to produce the pods. And over time, even some of the ones that are actually not going to produce pods, you may see one or two that appear on the trunk of the tree. Usually not a problem. We have a lot of viewers that are kind of west central Nebraska that have sent in questions about cedars and junipers in the landscape. We're not talking about the cedar in the pasture that's becoming a problem, but they have some dead limbs in them and a lot of dead brown needles. And their question is, if those needles just drop off, will those plants produce new shoots or new needles? The answer again is no on that. If you have an evergreen that has those dead shoots and the brown needles on it, that's a former branch. So in this case, what will have to happen is go ahead and cut that branch off back to live wood, maybe all the way back into the crown of the plant or at the main trunk. And then the only way really the big holes fill in is if some side branches can either come up from beneath or fill in from the top to make that happen. We're into pruning season for especially our deciduous plants and trees and shrubs. And this is a question that comes to us from the Columbus area about pruning crab apples. This is the time when you can start thinking about doing that. You don't want to take off too much of the growth because those will have set their flower buds from a previous season. You're going to take off the flowering. But it is a time when you can go ahead and take off some of the crossing branches, the interior shoots, making sure that you make proper pruning cuts. You don't want to take too much material off at once in a single season, because what that does with crab apples in particular is it will cause them to actually push even more of that sort of wild, adventitious growth. This is a viewer who is in the Fremont area, and they have some sumac, some of the staghorn sumac, which is really one of our interesting, beautiful ones with kind of a velvet on the twigs and great seed heads in the winter. And they wonder about tree-form sumac. Is there such a thing as a staghorn sumac that has a single trunk? It's an interesting question because what happens with this sumac and with smooth sumac as well is as those stems get older and taller, it appears as though it's a single trunk. What has happened is that tree has lost, or that shrub has lost a bit of its vigor and is no longer forming the suckers from the base. You've probably seen sumac along the roadside ditches forming these big colonies that turn red in the fall. And the question is, can you buy one that actually stays as a tree or train one that way? The answer is, again, no. The genetics of the plant are such that it wants to sucker and form a colony, but the great big ones like that, when they get really big and trunky, chances are that sumac patch has lost its vigor. If you cut that old tree-like stump out of there, you may get good suckering from the base to start it over again. You may have to start entirely over from scratch with a new plant. And our final question is one about herbs alive in the house. How do you keep herbs alive in the winter months and thriving so that they don't get all leggy and thin and spindly, so you can actually still use them for cooking in dishes like great soups and chilies in the winter months? A couple of things to keep in mind. First off, the more sunlight, the better. Many of our common cooking herbs like rosemary, thyme, chives love sunshine. They like the heat, they like the light. So the more light, the better. The other thing to pay really good attention to with herbs is excellent drainage. Many of them are from the Mediterranean, and if you put them in a condition where they're too damp, too dark, the soil is too soggy, chances are you're either going to get kind of a languishing yellowing color and then ultimately death, or you're certainly not going to get the quality of the herbs that you'd like. To wrap up today's program, we're going to return to problems with tomatoes. We showed you some possible strategies to avoid blossom end rot earlier in the show, but right now we'd like to focus on other disease problems. Once again, here's Amy Timmerman to help us keep our tomatoes healthy and red.
Looking at any disease management in our garden, those type of cultural methods in controlling diseases in your garden is huge, especially when we look at tomato diseases. That mulch, besides providing a lot of moisture and protection for our plants, is also keeping that soil off of the leaves of our plants, which is going to spread those spores from the soil line up to those lower leaves, and then it will move and progress continuously up the plant, and soon we'll have defoliation of the plant. The soaker hoses are also great disease management because we're providing that moisture right at the base of the plant, right at those root systems, and we're not getting that rain splashing that we'll see with overhead water irrigation, which is also going to sit there and move those spores from one leaf to the next leaf, and the disease will continue to progress up the plant, which we really want to try to avoid. So just those two little cultural managements can really reduce the amount of disease you're going to see in your garden setting, or even in your landscape setting when we're looking at foliar fungal diseases affecting our plants. On these tomatoes, we're seeing the typical symptoms that we see with early blight and septoria. Early blight, the easy way to diagnose it that disease is, if we look at the lesion, the fungus grows in rings. So you're going to see little ring patterns on that lesion. Concentric rings is what we call them. Very similar to see what you see in a tree when we cut it down. That's early blight. The other one that we see is septoria, which is going to give us those small black lesions with the yellow halos. All these fungal diseases that I'm talking about always start at the bottom of the plant and are going to work their way up. So one thing we already talked about with management is mulching and soaker hoses. The other thing to look at, especially when we look at these tomatoes right here, is they're down on the ground. We want to make sure we get our cages on properly, get the tomatoes up off the soil line itself to help really reduce the amount of disease that we're seeing. If the disease continues to progress, even with these cultural practices, we can do fungicide applications. The trick with fungicide applications, you need to read the product labels very clearly to know how long after an application you can actually eat the fruit. The other thing to do, I forgot to remind everybody, if we're seeing those leaves really turning yellow and starting to discolor, pinch them off and remove them from the garden. It reduces that inoculum source, and the amount of disease will also be suppressed in the same time. Some of the most common diseases that we'll see on tomatoes every single year consist of early blight, which is a fungal disease, septoria leaf blight, which is also another fungal disease. And those two diseases will affect the leaves primarily, giving us those nasty spots, yellowing, and defoliation of our plants during the growing season. The other two diseases that we commonly see in Nebraska is bacterial spot and bacterial speck. And with these being bacterial diseases, they act a little bit different than our fungal pathogens, but they're going to cause leaf spots. But the biggest thing that we typically see with these two diseases is they're going to affect the fruit themselves. So we're going to see spotting on that fruit, little black specks, almost look like fly specks. But all this specking is all on the outside of the tomato, so once you peel back the skin, we don't have a disease issue. And then the last disease we commonly see in tomatoes is a viral disease, and that's tomato spotted wilt virus. Once we get that fruit development setting on, the fruit, instead of being that nice red color that we're after, it's going to be blotchy. We're going to have blotches of red, yellow, and oranges on that fruit. You can still eat the fruit, it's no impact to you, but the virus can move from one tomato to the next and when we have thrips present. So we usually recommend removal of those infected plants and look at thrips using sticky traps to determine if an insecticide application is actually necessary to control the insects in your garden.
There just isn't anything like a fresh tomato from the garden. Simple things like selecting resistant varieties, good mulching practices, and avoiding overhead watering will help you avoid these common problems. Thank you so much for joining us again for Lifestyle Gardening. When we join you again on our next show, we'll finish up our features on viburnums and show you a way to extend your gardening season with your very own hoop house. So good morning, good gardening, thanks for watching, and we'll see you all next time on Lifestyle Gardening.